As we've been working our way through the Old Testament book of Habakkuk, we've seen some, I think, remarkable similarities between the circumstances prevalent in Habakkuk's time and those that we face today. Widespread sin and disobedience, idolatry, immorality, frustration in the perception that evil is winning. To be honest, these similarities can, if we're not careful, be disheartening because they serve as a reminder to us, frankly, of just how bad things are in our time. But I have some good news for you today. I have some good news for you today. As we move into chapter 2, we will encounter some very helpful ideas for responding to these difficult days. First from the prophet Habakkuk, and then from God himself. Let's read from Habakkuk chapter 2. I want to read the first 4 verses. Habakkuk speaking here. I will stand my watch and set myself on the rampart and watch to see what he will say to me and what I will answer when I am reproved. Then the Lord answered me and said, write the vision and make it plain on tablets, that he may run who reads it. For the vision is yet for an appointed time. But at the end it will speak, and it will not lie. Though it tarries, wait for it, because it will surely come. It will not tarry. Behold the proud. His soul is not upright in him, but the just shall live by his faith. From Habakkuk chapter 2. And right off the bat, at the very beginning there of chapter 2, we come to our first, what I think is brilliant and encouraging word of instruction from Habakkuk himself. It's like, here's an idea. Seek God, then listen for him. Seek God, then listen for him. In chapter 1 of Habakkuk, we were introduced to the detestable behavior of God's people. The southern kingdom of Judah. This was at the time when Israel was divided into 2 kingdoms. And Judah was the southern kingdom, and that's where Habakkuk prophesied. We saw as God's people were behaving poorly, we saw the anguish of Habakkuk as he cried out to God, how long shall I cry, and you will not hear? And why do you cause me to see trouble? And perhaps you and I are asking the same questions today. As we see trouble around us, perhaps we're asking the same questions. How long? Why? And you remember in chapter 1, we looked at this last week, God revealed to Habakkuk that he was going to raise up the Chaldeans. He was going to raise up the Chaldeans, also known as Babylon, to discipline Judah. And this caused Habakkuk to cry out even more intensely. Really? The Chaldeans? Evil Babylon? I mean, you remember? Habakkuk said, yeah, Judah's pretty bad, but the Chaldeans are even worse. And so he cried out even more intensely to God. It's as if he's saying, really, is this your plan? Is this really how you're going to respond to the evil in our generation? Now, as we move to chapter 2, Habakkuk teaches us this important lesson. Seek God, yes, but then listen for him. He says in verse 1, I will stand my watch and set myself on the rampart and watch to see what he will say to me and what I will answer when I am reproved. This is a vivid picture that sometimes we may kind of just read through it and not really see the vivid picture that Habakkuk is painting here. It's a vivid picture of one who has now dedicated himself to be on the watch. It's a picture of, it's in military terms. He says, I will set myself upon the rampart. In military terms, a rampart, it's a high wall. And the wall is wide enough that a person can position himself or herself on top of the wall and walk back and forth. It's the way a sentry would serve in the military. You go up high enough so that you can see all around. You can get a good vision of things that the enemy is doing. You can get a good visual image, perhaps of maybe some offensive strategy. But that watchman is up there in that high spot on the rampart. And the watchman typically, often, is working at night. Everyone else is asleep, or even in the day, everyone else is kind of going about their business. But the watchman makes the decision or is assigned the position, your job is to watch. And that's what Habakkuk says he will do. He said, I will set myself as the watchman. I will listen for God's answer. The idea here is you're wanting to gather the intelligence that's needed, that then would be passed on to the fellow soldiers. Intel that would ensure the best opportunity for victory. That's the picture that Habakkuk is painting here in this first verse. The best watchman sets himself on the rampart and takes his stand and recognizes, I have one duty, one task. I have a singular focus as a watchman. And that's what Habakkuk is telling us as we read verse 1. I have a singular focus, and my singular focus is on God. Habakkuk is saying, if I can step back, to that 20,000-foot view, he's saying, I have sought God. Now, as we go into chapter 2, multiple times, he says, I have sought God, but now I listen. In our circumstances, there is no doubt in my mind that many of us seek God. There's no question in my mind. As we look at the trouble and turmoil, as we look at the moral decay of our culture, there is no doubt in my mind that many of us seek God. We seek His will. We seek His direction. We seek His help. Probably even we seek His intervention. But in the circumstances of our time, I wonder sometimes if we then pause long enough to listen, to hear Him. God speaks to us through His Word. God speaks to us by His Spirit. And I just wonder sometimes if we seek Him, but do we then stand the watch? Do we then pause to listen and hear His response? He will respond. He will respond, as He did to Habakkuk. And we move to verse 2. The Lord answered me. The Lord responded. Habakkuk got in position to listen. He paid attention, and the Lord responded. The Lord answered me and said, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, that he may run who reads it. And here I think the Lord is giving us another helpful and encouraging instruction about how we ought to respond during these circumstances that we find ourselves in. Seek God, but listen, right? Here's another idea. Hear clearly, then share clearly. In that order. Hear clearly, then share clearly. I submit to you this morning, God does not mumble. God does not speak in confusion. God spoke to Habakkuk. He made it clear that he would raise up Babylon, the Chaldeans, as a way to discipline the people of Judah. But in the end, victory would come for God's people. The foe will be defeated and Judah will be delivered. On Wednesday, if we kept reading in chapter 2, I'm not going to do that this morning, but I'm going to on Wednesday. On Wednesday in our midweek online Bible study, we're going to look at the rest of chapter 2. And in this chapter 2, there's a listing of the woes that are about to fall on Babylon, on the Chaldeans. When I say about to, it's going to take some time. But when God's plan is executed, there are going to be some woes. And so God is giving Habakkuk a little heads up. In essence, God's saying, you're right, Habakkuk. Those people are more evil than Judah. But Judah must be disciplined. And so God's going to raise up the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, to discipline Judah. But then, woe to those who are even more evil. And we're going to look at those woes because they're pretty interesting. We're going to look at those on Wednesday night. But the promise here is that Judah will be delivered. So there's the plan. And God said, write it down. Make it clear and plain. Some commentators, where it says make it clear and plain, believe that it had to do with write it really large. Might. But one thing we know for sure, God's saying, keep it simple. Keep it clear. This isn't complicated. Victory will come. The message remains the same for us today. This isn't rocket science. Good will prevail. God's people will know victory sooner or later. One way or another. God's people will be spared. And the second part of God's message to Habakkuk is now spread the news. That's the part that he may run who reads it. You know, when you read God's plan, that ought to make us so excited. I mean, it really should, that we want to run and tell others, that we want to spread the good news. This is only temporary. God's will be done, and God's people will prevail. One way or another, sooner or later. We know how the story ends. And I know a lot of folks, they spend a lot of time trying to figure out, well, this represents this, and this is going to happen then. And then. You know what I got to say to you this morning? I want to keep it plain and simple. It's good news. We've read the end of the book, and God's people win. For those of us who want our answers, and we want them now, we need to see verse 3. We want to remember now, the sentry, the watchman, doesn't just gather the intel and keep it to himself or herself. You're up there on the rampart. You hear from God. You get the message, and this is the primary way that we hear from God, right here. We get the message of good news Now we spread the news. That's the job of the church. Can I say it? The job of the church is not to win elections. The job of the church is not to straighten people out in terms of act this way because you ought to act this way. The job of the church is to straighten people out by spreading the good news and letting people know the love of Jesus and experience the love of Jesus, and you'd be surprised at how behavior will change. But for those of us that want our answers, and we don't want them now, am I the only one? We need to see verse 3. For the vision is yet for an appointed time. But at the end it will speak, and it will not lie. Though it tarries, wait for it, because it will surely come. It will not tarry. We need to see that. God gives Habakkuk a strong hint that his plan would come to pass, but it would come to pass over a period of time. It may be the same for us. We may have to endure times like the times that we're in for a period of time. We want things to change. As I said last week, we want things to go back like they used to be. And we want it to happen tomorrow. But we may have to endure times like these for a period of time. But if it does take a period of time, as I've mentioned to you before, I count that a blessing because that gives us more time to reach more people with the good news of the plan. That's good news for us. And in the meantime, God says to Habakkuk, trust humbly. Here's an idea. Trust humbly and live by faith. So God gave Habakkuk this hint that this plan might be carried out over a period of time. From the time of this prophecy, it was likely 20 or more years before the Babylonian captivity came. And then, depending on which timeline you follow, the people of God were captive, receiving God's discipline. They were held captive for something like 48 or 70 years. So do the math. From the time of this prophecy until the time God's people experienced freedom in terms of temporal freedom was something in the range of 70 to 100 years, depending on which timelines that you look at. Think about where you were 70 years ago. I thought so. You want to wait that long? We don't, do we? We don't even want to wait 48 years. We don't even want to wait 20 years for the beginning of God's plan here. We want our answers, and we want them now. And God gave a very strong hint to Habakkuk. This is going to be carried out over time. And you and I may be facing the same kind of situation where God's plan is carried out over time. But God's message before, during, and after this episode of time was exactly the same. Humbly live by faith. Verse 4. The just will live by faith. God says, behold the proud at the beginning of verse 4. Behold the proud. I personally, this could refer to the proud Chaldeans or Babylonians. I personally think that's what the reference here is to. I personally think that what God is saying here in verse 4 to Habakkuk is saying, yeah, you're right. Look at the proud Chaldeans. You've guessed it right there. They behave worse than the people of the southern kingdom. I personally think that refers to them. It could, however, also, or instead of, it could refer to the people of the southern kingdom of Judah. They were also quite proud. They had gone their own way. They had begun to worship idols. So it could be referring to the proud Jews of the southern kingdom. I don't know, as we go through this series of messages, it could refer to you and me. Behold the proud. God says his soul is not upright in him, the proud. His soul is not upright in him. But then contrast the proud with the just. God says the just shall live by his faith. Live by faith. Very interesting, I think, that God contrasted those who were not right with pride. Contrasted that with the ones who live by faith, were those who were not proud. We humbly live by faith. And living by faith, again, I've said this a couple of times through this series, but I want to make sure we remember this. Live by faith is not simply, oh yeah, I made a declaration, my faith is in Jesus. I got saved when I was a kid. That's not what living by faith means. Living by faith means living by faith. Yes, it means I trust in Jesus for my salvation. But it also means I trust in him to walk with me, to guide my life. And I obey what he instructs. Jesus used the term over in John chapter 15, abide. If you abide in me. That's what living by faith means. It means abiding in Jesus. Continually practicing obedience. Continually practicing trust. Even if it takes longer than you and I want. Abide. What a great idea. I hope that between Habakkuk and the Lord through Habakkuk, I hope today that we've seen some pretty good ideas for dealing with and responding to the circumstances in which we live today. Let's pray. Lord, we love you today.